Welcome back, everybody, to Ladies Leading Live. This week, we are going to talk about communication. So, we've been on a journey together over the last 5 weeks up to today, week 6, where we've talked about, actually, week 7, because we started with an overarching one. We started talking about these female leadership competencies and the things that we were learning from the women that we were interviewing for Ladies Leading. And we've talked about things like self-advocacy, self-awareness, courage, intuition, resilience, and those things I feel like were maybe new to the conversation or maybe not as of a hot topic as regularly as maybe we talk about things like communication and relationships, the next two competencies. And I think communication is a really important one for us to address and a really important one for us to talk about for a number of reasons. I think as women, we know that communication tends to be sort of this minefield for us as women in the workplace, that we're constantly sort of navigating unfair and unequal expectations and assessments of our communication. There's tons of data, as most of us know, out there that says women are unfairly criticized and unfairly judged when we deliver assertive, direct, honest communication, where those are things that are valued in male leaders, those are things that are not valued in female leaders. And so it becomes very challenging for women to figure out how to navigate the communication minefield, particularly when you are an assertive, direct, and honest communicator, like myself. I often got lots of feedback about my communication style as a leader, that I was too honest, that people could see my emotions on my sleeve, that I was too direct, that I come off too harsh, that I was intimidating. And in every spot where I would get glowing feedback about my performance, about my outcomes, about all of these things I had achieved for organizations, there was always sort of this but that would come with it that was riddled with feedback about my communication. And, communication feedback that I was used to getting as a female, that was about being too honest, being too assertive, being too blunt, being too direct, coming off too harsh, not sugarcoating things. And I think that that's the challenge that a lot of women face. And I heard that repeatedly over and over and over again from the women that we talked to. But one of the things that stood out to me from my conversations with them was that they had sort of learned what I would call the finesse of conversation, and that they had sort of learned how to navigate a variety of different personalities and get their messages across to people in a way that they could receive them. And I think that is one of the lessons that I have learned in my career as a female leader around communication, that I may have a natural way of communicating, and I may have a natural affinity or propensity to be direct and to be honest and to be assertive. And that may be what's most natural to me, but that's not always the best way to communicate. And unfortunately, some people perceive that and react in a negative way. And so, part of what I think these leaders have learned is communication is best delivered in the way that the person that's hearing it can best receive the message. And that means that as women, we have to learn how to finesse feedback. We have to learn how to finesse opinions. We have to learn how to finesse information so that the person that we're talking to can receive it from us. And that may not mean that it's an inherent natural way that we communicate. I hate to say that because for me, that is so counter to what I believe about authenticity. And sometimes it's very challenging for me to even think about how I navigate those communication obstacles on a day-to-day basis in my career. You know, there are people that I can be totally and completely honest with and deliver stuff to them in a way where I don't have to worry about finessing it for them. And then there are people where you have to learn how to finesse certain things and know the ways that they'll receive the information and ways that potentially trigger them or cause them to shut down or cause them to not hear you in the way that they need to hear you. And I think that that's the real struggle for us as women is to learn that finesse and to understand that that finesse looks different for every single person that we come in contact with and every single person that we communicate with on a regular basis. And I think that that's what sucks about being a girl, because I don't know if our male counterparts and our male peers actually put that much thought into the way that they deliver messages. And maybe they should. You know, I have a colleague, her name's Patty, and Patty works a lot with people who have communication issues as leaders, and coaches them to sort of adapt their communication style. And, you know, I just wonder if that is what she's teaching people, sort of the art of finesse of communication and helping people understand that you can't always just deliver communication in the way that feels most authentic to you if you actually want people to hear you. And I think that's the difference. You can communicate in whatever way you want, but if you want people to hear you, you have to give it to them in a way that they will hear it. And that takes a little bit of finessing. The other piece that I think is interesting that sort of popped out of a lot of the conversations offline I had with these female leaders was this idea of learning when to dig in and argue and fight and advocate for what you want, and when to, as one female leader I talked to, when to acquiesce, when to know when you need to fight, and when to know when you need to sort of like let it go, and that some battles really aren't worth picking, and some things really aren't worth fighting, and that your lack of fight or your lack of pushing back on certain things earns you some extra points to use later, or earns you some extra trust to be able to leverage at a later date, or allows you to not have some negative interactions that will allow you to have more positive interactions down the road. And I think that's the other piece around communication for women, is sort of learning what things we let roll off of our back and what things that we don't. So, funny story. I was in Dallas for a conference a couple of years ago, and I was at the airport and called for a lift, and L-Y-F-T, not a L-I-F-T, and called for a lift. And in true Texas form, my Lyft driver was a very tall, very, very large man in a cowboy hat in a pickup truck, who picked me up. And I hopped in the front seat with him, as I typically do with a lot of Lyft drivers back in the day when we got in cars with strangers. And we started talking. And at one point we were talking about what he did and lessons learned. And, you know, he was working with some underprivileged youth in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And we were talking about things that he had taught them and conversations he had had with these young men. And he said, you know, one of the pieces of advice I give them, Jessica, and I said, what? Give it to me. I mean, this guy was just full of all these really amazing anecdotes. And he said, be a duck, not a chicken. And I was like, okay, I haven't really heard that feedback before. So tell me what you mean by that. Like, be a duck, not a chicken. He said, well, have you ever dumped a bucket of water on a chicken? And I said, can't say that I have. And he said, well, if you dump a bucket of water on a chicken, they end up looking like a rat. They soak up all the water. Their feathers soak up all the water and they look ridiculous. But if you dump a bucket of water on a duck, it rolls right off their back and you don't even notice that they're wet. And I went like, whoa, that like really blew my mind a little bit. Great advice. And I think that, you know, when I think about communication for women, we have to decide we have to decide to be a duck, not a chicken, in some aspects of letting things roll off of our back a little bit every once in a while, instead of letting all that stuff absorb into us. I think that there's a lot of things that we encounter on a day-to-day basis at work that are worth fighting for, that are worth speaking up about, that are worth advocating for, that are important for us to speak up, share our opinions, push back, disagree, whatever it is. But there are things in our day-to-day lives and in our work where we probably need to just let it roll off of our back. And understanding that letting certain things roll off our back when they're seemingly not very important allows us to lean in on the things that are, and allows us to truly be heard when it becomes really important. If we're one of those people that squawks every time that something bad happens, or every time that something minor occurs, when it really matters, our voice isn't as loud as it needs to be. And I think there are times where we have to learn to let things roll off of our back. Does that mean that we let the really important stuff slide? Heck no. Does that mean that we let harassment or injustice or inequity or bias happen and let it roll off our back? Oh no, absolutely not. But there are some things that maybe aren't really worth it. And I think that that's the thing that I learned from these female leaders was they'd sort of mastered the ability to evaluate what stuff they let roll off their back and what stuff they put their foot down for and what stuff they advocated for. And they also mastered the ability to finesse the communication in a way where people above them and below them could hear the message. And I think that that's really the big piece about communication for women. We're unfairly judged. It is what it is. And that's cultural. That's societal. And the reality is that cultural and societal norms are very hard to overcome and are very challenging to change. Does that mean that we don't start and continue to try? No. But that does mean that we understand that we're navigating in a world that unfairly judges our communication. And that in order for us to be heard, that means we have to adapt. That means that we have to finesse a little bit more than we're comfortable with. And that compounds if you identify not just as female, but you have an intersection of another historically marginalized identity. So if you're a woman of color, or if you're not straight, or if you're not Christian, or if you have a physical impairment, like any of those things compounds to our ability to be perceived authentically. And so that's the challenge with communication. And I wish I had better news. But the thing that I really found from the women that we talked to is that they had really learned the art of finessing the communication. We can change culture as we ascend into higher levels of leadership. We can work to change the perception of female communication as we ascend into higher levels of leadership. But I think in order to get to those higher levels of leadership, we have to learn the finesse of communication that allows us to be heard and allows us to ascend. And I don't think that's just for women. I think that's also for men too. And I think, I think of my colleague Patty and the coaching work that she does. And a lot of the people that she works with are she works with men and women. So it's not exclusive to female leaders. It's not exclusive to women learning how to communicate better. I think it's everyone that needs to learn how to finesse the conversation in a way that people can hear it. Communication is less about the deliverer and more about the receiver. And we have to communicate in a way that the receiver can receive it. So that's what I got for communication. We could probably dig in there. There's tons of interesting stuff about the way men communicate versus the way that women communicate, the way that men listen versus the way that women listen. There's lots of really interesting resources and information around that stuff that I think helps us learn how to finesse the conversations and finesse our communication. Next week, we're going to talk about relationships and not just people that you work with, not just networking. There's some really interesting stuff that we've learned from the women that we've talked to about relationships as well. And that will draw us to a close on our 7 female leadership competencies. Don't forget, registration for the Ladies Leading Masterclass is open. You can learn more at ladies-leading.com/masterclass. It starts March 10th and runs for 8 months, and we meet twice a month. So if you have questions, please feel free to send us a message on Facebook or email us. We'll see you next time as we talk about relationships on Ladies Leading Live. Thanks, everyone.